Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is again a short lecture on how to use Excel. What we want to do today is to analyze data a little bit more into depth. That means without the prior known functions like we did the last few times. So what we want to do today is analyze large amounts of data as it is usually in lots of companies. So what you see here is the typical list that you get out of a database. Here, for example, I prepared a list of employees with different regions, customer names, order dates, product groups, product details, the amount, how many products were bought or sold, the buying price per product. We have a calculation by the total buying price. We have a calculation of the profit according to the product, as we have seen with the VLOOKUP function. And we have a selling price without VAT. We could have another column with the selling price including VAT as a new calculation. If we just jump down a little bit, so you see that this is 62,000 rows. So it's not too much, but at least some data. What we can do, of course, is now doing sums and sum if and sum if to calculate some kind of combinations, like we want to know which employee sold where, how much. And the idea, of course, is to have these calculations being as flexible as possible. That is the major problem, because that normally is with basic functions not able to do. So what we want to do is we play around with data. And to do so, one of the most important things is the pivot table. That means we are arranging fields here, but prior to the pivot table, we need to make sure that there are some prerequisites available here in the table. The first one is there have to be headlines. So every column should have its own headline and its unique headline, so that the headline later on defines the name of the column. That is kind of the most important thing. Then if we do pivot table, we don't need to mark the whole table here, because Excel is quite good in seeing what you want to analyze. A short check is never wrong. So A1 to K61,887 seems to be quite okay. You see it also here being marked, and the selection in most of the cases is very good. If you don't want to use those data that you are in, you could use external data. And by using external data, you could choose from databases or other locations where the information for the analysis is coming from. Additionally, I can only recommend, if you choose to use the pivot table, choose it on a new worksheet, not on existing worksheets, due to the fact that the pivot table is very, very flexible, but also flexible in size. And that means that you want to play around. And by that, if there is something already on the worksheet, it might happen that you override it by changing the pivot table. So if we use the selected table and the new worksheet and click on OK, we get a new worksheet, as you can see here, and we get a worksheet where the typical pivot table view is on the right hand side with a field list. So this part, if you ever accidentally click on hiding it, can be activated by the pivot table tools in the register card of analysis. You can switch the pivot field list on and off. The pivot table itself is empty due to the fact that the listed columns here are not assigned to any of the important regions. The most important fields are column and rows and the value field. In the column and rows part, if you drag and drop one of those fields in there, it is to be grouped. Grouping means that if we drag and drop, for example, the employee inside, the employee is not shown as many times as he is in the list, but only once. And the same is then, for example, for the region, and you see that we can have additional combinations for those data. You can arrange them differently, and if you put both in the same part, like both in the row or both in the column, then the grouping is done from the top to the bottom. That means it first is grouped for the employee, and within employee, it's grouped for the product detail. And if we switch it around, you see for every product who did buy or sell it. And that's kind of the idea as well in the rows as in the column. I'm getting asked quite often which one to take into the rows, which one to take in the columns. Doesn't matter too much because I'm preferring to put those into the columns where fewer selections are in there, because there are fewer columns than rows in the display due to the fact that it is kind of a typical view of Excel to be having more rows than columns visible. And the additional thing is we could have, for example, a total buying price and having it to be summed up. And if we drag and drop a field which consists of numbers into the value part, it does automatically sum it up. If we drag and drop something with a text inside, it automatically counts. And that means we know that the AMD K7 700 Athlon is bored 698 times by Mr. Bauer and 976 times by Mr. Baumgarten. So the counting and the sum are the two basic functions within here. And that's as easy as it is. So you drag and drop your fields and you say, well, oh no, I didn't want to do the employees. I wanted to have the regions. You simply drag and drop them around and you get your new results without any other problems here. And what we want to do, of course, is now to think about what we want to see and where are combinations that are sensible. And due to the fact that we can now work in here, I want to make sure that there's a filters part. So if we drag and drop kind of filters inside, we could make sure that we don't see everything, because at the beginning employee is set to all here in the filters part, and we could set, well, I would just want to see Mr. Bauer, or I just want to see Mr. Meyer. And that is the idea of it. Also here is the possibility of selecting multiple items. Just be aware that he will not show the three single ones, but a total of the three. So this is all the three together. And that is kind of the idea of the filter. I'm not a big fan of the filters anymore due to the fact that in the current version of Excel, there is the same idea with slicers, which look much more nice or cool, or what do you want to do. If we do it here with the same idea as the employees, you see that we have the choice here of choosing the proper name rather than selecting them. And as we are used to select multiple items, if you press the control key, so STRG, we could select also more of them, or even say, well, go back to the original setting. That is kind of the basics about the pivot table. So what we want to do is play around with them. If you want to get rid of them, again, you can simply delete by marking them and press the delete button. This is not all that Excel is capable of, because if you go down here, you have different kind of settings, which is the same here for doing additional fields and filters and column labels. And also you could use the drop down fields up here where you could sort them, for example, ascending or descending. And we could use the selection, because normally everything is displayed, and if we, for example, just want to compare east and west, we could easily deselect everything and only select east and west and get the information that we want to focus on. Whatever you do within the pivot table, it's a very, very simple rule: less is more. So what you want to do is you don't want to put all the information inside here, because then it really gets too large, and a pivot table is there for explaining a large amount of data more easily than anything else. and that is lost at the moment when you put too many informations into the pivot table. So what I want to do is rather do several small pivot tables than one really large pivot table with everything inside. At the values part, there are some other things that you might be interested in. One thing is at the value field setting. This is the part where you could switch between all the summarized values, being sum, count, average, maximum, minimum, product, standard deviation, and variance. So that's kind of the typical functions that we want to use. For example, if we want to go for an average, or if we want to go for the variance here, so we know how much they differ. That is kind of the way to switch in here. Additionally, what you can do here, rather than doing it outside, is within the value field settings, you have the numbering format, where you can say, well, I want to have it as a currency with only one decimal, and if it gets negative, I want to have it in red, and everything is adapted and makes it much more readable. Additionally, sometimes it's not so important to have the exact value, but to have it in a percentage field. So in the values, there is the option to switch between the summarized values to show values as. A typical way is no calculation, but you could switch it to a percentage of the column, and that means now I know that in the centrals it's quite evenly distributed, except of the Duron, which is very low, and the Pentium, which is with 10.4% quite high. So it's easier to see the typical distribution than if you see the absolute numbers. And the same is for the rows. You could use it like this. So the Athlon 24% and 33% in the east and south, and the north is not looking very good. So you have to decide and to play around what you want to do, what you want to see, and what you expect. And sometimes if you play around and drag and drop some fields and change some fields, you might come to a new conclusion that you might have not seen before. Due to the fact that it is a typical Excel thing, we have additional things appear. One thing is to make it look nicer, so add grand totals or subtotals. We have a reporting layout that you can choose from. We can decide how blank rows should be handled. We can say, well, do you want to have row headers or not row headers? And there is typical styles, templates that you can use to make it look a little bit more nicer or funnier. Or I'm preparing it mostly to be as easy as possible, because I'm interested in the numbers, not so much into how to display it nicer. Another thing that you might want to know is, of course, there's a lot of other things, like you could calculate fields, because sometimes the profit, for example, could be also calculated within here, or the selling price could be calculated in here with formulas. We could do a pivot chart out of the table. Just be aware the pivot chart and the pivot table are connected. That means if you change the chart afterwards, or if you change the table afterwards, vice versa will be changed. What we want to do is, in the rows and in the columns, you could group. And that means if I want to group things, I can group them either by marking them all together, if they're beside each other, or if they're not beside each other, I could say, well, take east and west together. So by pressing the control key or STRG key. And then after choosing some of them, you can say, well, and now do group them. And you see that the one group is done by east and west, and the others are groups on their own. And now I could say, well, and additionally take north and south and group them. And now we have a central group, we have a group 1 with east and west, and we have a group 2 with north and south. The subtotals and the grand totals are handled over here. So if we want to not show those subtotals, we could simply switch them off by the design part. So that is kind of typical choices. If you want to get rid of those groups, again, you simply ask the fields to ungroup here. So what we do is we mark them and then we ungroup them again. Oops. And inside then we could come to our new conclusion and say, well, how does it look like, and how do we want to analyze those data? Go back, and here again, we'll go back to our new calculation part. So the grouping can be done by hand. Sometimes if you have fields in a different way inside, the grouping is done automatically, like here, because we have in the list we have ordering dates, and in our list he groups them automatically together in month. And if we are inside here and use the group selection, you see that typical selection is the month and days. We could say, well, we want to have it in years, quarters, and month, and then you see that the grouping is an automation which is only there for date. So he shows, yeah, he knows this is a date, and so we can tell him we want to group them. And inside, of course, we could say, well, I'll only show the quarters and totals. We don't want to have those month inside, so we get a better overview of the year 2000 and the typical sellings here. This is the one part, and if we have a numbering inside, we could have a different kind of grouping, which I'm showing you shortly by deciding to give you another file, just taking care that we choose the right one. So we have kind of an overview here where we have kind of a typical list of the names of gender, qualification, department, age, starting date, and the wage. And if we analyze this by clicking inside, tell him insert with pivot table in a new worksheet, we could play around with the different departments, with different sum of the wages, and we could take the age inside. And if we do so, you see that every age is listed here. And if we now click and say group selection, you see that in the numbering he's a little bit different than with the date format. He tells us the lowest number here is 18, the highest is 57, and the incremental increase would be 10 now as a suggestion. We could say, well, let's start at 15, ending at 57 is okay, and we want to increase, let's say, by 7 years. And if we now say okay, you see that the 50 to 21-year-olds get that sum of the wage, and we could also kind of switch to average, so we know in average what the people are earning in what age category in which department. And that is kind of playing around, and sometimes you see something new that you might have not noticed if you look at the long list, because the long list looks quite normal. And if we here, for example, drop out the department and include the gender, then we see that on average the females are earning more than the males, which seems to be quite unusual. So I'm not quite sure if this company really exists. So that is something that you have a hard time seeing out of that list. But if you play around with the pivot table, it might be that you come to such a conclusion here. Hope that helps, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. See you.